So we're all told to open up, to share our feelings, to be honest, but so many of us do it wrong. No one tells you that if you screw up being vulnerable, you actually end up pushing your partner away. So in this video, I'm going to break down what vulnerability is. I'm going to talk about why most of us do it wrong, and then I'm going to talk about what we can do in order to be more vulnerable in a more effective way. So vulnerability is powerful. It's one of the most important tools in emotional connection, in healing a relationship and building trust. But most people, especially us men, sorry guys, we were never taught how to do it in a healthy, grounded way. So what happens? We weaponize it, we dump it, we hide behind it, and then we wonder why our partner is pulling away from us. You know, I struggled with this for a long time. Vulnerability is not something that is taught, especially to us guys. And oftentimes we can think that we are being vulnerable. We can think that we are doing the right thing, right? You know, sometimes we can go to therapy and the therapist can be like, hey, you need to express your feelings more. You need to be more vulnerable. But oftentimes we're never really taught how to do that. And then when we try to be vulnerable, we do it in a really ineffective way. The truth is that vulnerability isn't a confession booth. It's leadership. If you do vulnerability well, it creates what we call emotional safety. If you do it wrong, it ends up creating more chaos. So I want to break down the 7 most common ways that people screw up vulnerability. The first one is that we overshare too soon. So when you dump deep trauma or secrets early on, it can feel really unsafe and overwhelming. And this especially happens in the beginning of relationships. Vulnerability can sometimes be done in a way that is what people call trauma dumping, which is just emotionally vomiting out all of your feelings, all of your worries, all of your fears, all of your insecurities, doing it in an emotionally overwhelming way. But the truth is that vulnerability requires trust, and trust takes time. So if you end up sharing page 100 before you've even earned page 10, you're not connecting, you're just unloading. The next biggest mistake in trying to be vulnerable is expecting instant validation. So oftentimes people can open up and then expect their partner to instantly agree or comfort you or make you feel better. Unfortunately, this isn't the way that vulnerability works. This is actually creating more emotional pressure. If you're always opening up expecting validation, what this ultimately does is this puts a lot of pressure on your partner to just simply agree with you, to do the duties of validating you when the responsibility for validation is ultimately on yourself. So vulnerability is not there for you to gain validation. Sharing your feelings is not there with the expectation that your partner is there to validate you. Ultimately, vulnerability is a gift, it's not a transaction. If you need immediate validation, you're not opening up, you're actually just setting up a trap. You're setting up your partner to fail because you create an expectation that they haven't agreed to. The third mistake is using vulnerability to manipulate. Oftentimes, this doesn't come in a conscious way. This can be very subconscious. But if you find yourself using vulnerability to guilt trip or to win an argument, this isn't real vulnerability. That is emotional leverage. So let's say you and your partner are talking about something and then you jump in with, well, quite frankly, I'm scared to open up to you because you're always just so mean to me. That isn't being vulnerable in the moment. That is not you coming from a place of vulnerability. That is you utilizing vulnerability to try to win an argument, to try to change the narrative. If you are being honest, but without humility, this is just control in disguise. Another mistake in vulnerability is being vague or indirect. You know, for example, if you say, well, I just feel weird lately, without naming the specific fear or emotion, this makes it really impossible to connect. You know, you don't want your partner to have to play the therapist to decode your feelings. You're not being vulnerable, you're hiding. You're not putting in the work yourself in order to figure out these feelings yourself. So learn to be more specific. So if you're not being specific, then that means you're putting the work and the burden onto other people. The next way that a lot of people misuse vulnerability is making it all about them. So saying things like, I'm scared that you're going to leave me. This comes off as needy or blaming. Instead, owning your emotion. For example, I notice that I get anxious when I feel distance between us. But that is just my perception of distance. Maybe you see it differently. You see the difference? The first way is falling into what we call the blame illusion. The blame illusion is the opposite of responsibility. So being responsible is owning your emotions. Falling for the blame illusion is when you're blaming other people for your emotions, right? So taking responsibility is owning your emotions, processing them, and understanding them deeply so that the work isn't put onto other people. And that way, in separating it out, you're separating your feelings out away from your partner's actions. And this means that you don't make it all about them. And that leads me on to the next point, which is not taking responsibility. So talking about your past pain without owning how you contributed to patterns ends up sounding like victimhood. So if every story is about how somebody else hurt you, you're not opening up, you're outsourcing your responsibility. So when you're being vulnerable, being able to talk about your past pain in the context of understanding how you contributed to the situation. For example, this could be a matter of, I felt really hurt when my previous partner cheated on me. But that being said, I think I treated her really badly. And I think that a lot of the reason why she did cheat on me is because she needed more than I was able to give at that time. This is taking responsibility without being a victim of other people. And this can be very hard at first, because when we feel hurt, when we feel hard done to, our automatic reaction can be to blame other people, to blame the world around us. But ultimately falling into this feedback loop of victimhood ends up meaning that we play the victim rather than end up being vulnerable. We don't talk about things from a place of perspective. We don't talk vulnerably. We talk as a victim. And that isn't being vulnerable. This is, again, putting the emotional pressure on your partner to make you feel better, because they're doing all the processing and work and coming up with these alternate perspectives on your behalf. But the biggest mistake that so many people make with vulnerability is using it to avoid action. So being vulnerable but not actually working on the issue leaves you and your partner stuck. So for example, let's say you are scared of commitment. Saying you're scared of commitment but then not doing anything about it, it doesn't really matter if you're not doing anything about it. Just having an emotion without any sort of plan moving forward on how to process that emotion means that you're not really taking action on it. And again, this is using vulnerability as an excuse not to put in the work. This is kind of like pointing out a burning building, saying, oh man, this burning building's terrible, and that's it. Vulnerability needs to also be accompanied with action. Pointing out a problem, pointing out a challenge, an emotion on its own can leave the expectation on your partner to figure it out for you, for your partner to take action on that for you. If you do feel scared, then it's your responsibility to figure that out, to figure out that emotion, either changing that emotion, looking at it in a different way, challenging your interpretations, or take the action on how to get over that fear. At the end of the day, if that emotion is causing an issue in the relationship, there are ways to work through that. But just simply saying it from a place of vulnerability is not a very effective way of being vulnerable, because you're pointing out a challenge, but then you're not coming up with any solutions for yourself. If you're being vulnerable, but you're not choosing to grow from this, then it means that you're allowing that emotion to pick up inertia, right? So you're allowing it to pick up speed and head continually in the same direction. It's kind of like you're not putting the brakes on the emotion. You're not challenging that emotion. You're simply letting it happen. So how do you use vulnerability effectively? Well, real, healthy vulnerability can look very different. The first key point of utilizing vulnerability is starting with self-awareness. So checking in with yourself before you open up. Like, what do you really feel specifically? And what do you want to share and why? This is going to be really crucial. Understanding what it is that you want to be vulnerable about, but the why behind it. Why are you saying this? Because ultimately we can sit there and be quote unquote vulnerable and sit there and say every single emotion that we're possibly feeling, that we have felt for the past 6 months. And this just becomes a fire hose of emotions. And this is draining. And this vulnerability loses all effectiveness. So being specific about what the emotion is, about what the vulnerability is, and understanding and being deliberate about why you want to share it. Prioritizing if this is something that is a priority, or is this something that is a passing, fleeting moment. Understanding your why as to being vulnerable, how it has an impact on things, and what the expectations are going to be really, really crucial to be vulnerable in an effective way that builds connection rather than pushes someone away. Next, it's really important to speak clearly and own it fully. So coming from a place of using, you may have heard I statements. I feel XYZ, I feel ABC. But being specific, don't make them guess and don't make them responsible for your emotions. For example, I've noticed that I pull away when I feel criticized, and I'm working on that. I've got a plan in place to work through those emotions. Notice how that whole entire sentence is taking responsibility, and it's talking about my feelings, but it also comes with action. I've noticed that I pull away when I feel criticized, not when I am criticized, when I feel criticized, and I'm working on it. All of this puts all of the control onto me. So it means that the emotional weight of it, the processing, isn't all put on your partner. But the third crucial thing is to let it lead to growth. Vulnerability should move the relationship forward. It should be paired with action, with intention, and with ownership. Like we mentioned before, vulnerability without growth is like complaining who the president is without voting. Vulnerability needs to be accompanied with some sort of action. This is what a lot of my members have found, is that getting out of the venting phase and into the action taking stage is going to be really crucial for repairing any relationship. Being vulnerable is human. It's something that builds connection, but it needs to be done in an effective way and from a state of growth, focusing on what is in your control and being able to process your emotions. Planning action to overcome this challenge should always be the steps to be taken before being vulnerable. This way you have a plan, you have an action plan to move forward through it. And this is what happens with so many of my members as they work together. They realize that just knowing things conceptually isn't enough. There has to be some sort of action in order to overcome these challenges, right? And this is what repairs so many relationships, is that once you realize that you have so much control in your hands as to how you navigate relationships and these skills and grow yourself, that is where relationships start to turn around. And vulnerability will always start with self-awareness. And if you do want to start this journey too, and you want to join the members and I, then join my relationship bootcamp, where you'll learn the same fundamentals that all of my members start with to rebuild, repair, and grow their relationships. All you have to do is click on the link in the description to grab your spot. Ultimately, vulnerability is about self-leadership. It's about taking control of the things that are in your control and focusing on that, rather than putting all the weight onto your partner. And through doing this, you'll actually find that your partner is more receptive to allowing you the grace to be more vulnerable, because you're already taking action on the challenges that you're pointing out in your vulnerability. You're leading the way, and that motivates your partner to allow you the grace and space to continue to do that. I've spoken a lot about emotions and how your perception on things changes the way you act in relationships. Mastering your emotions, especially when it comes to vulnerability and talking about your feelings, is going to be absolutely crucial for repairing any relationship, let alone growing it moving forward. So I'm going to leave you with that deep dive video on emotions and relationships, and I will see you over there.